Welcome to Truthful Crime Cases, where we explore the depths of human behavior to uncover the truth behind some of the most startling crimes. Today, we take you to Shaker Heights, Ohio, a peaceful, upper-middle-class suburb. But beneath its serene exterior, a dark scheme was unfolding, one that would ultimately lead to murder. This is the story of a husband's dark obsession that drove him to poison his wife, all in pursuit of marrying her daughter. Carol McMillan, 48, was a woman with big dreams and a close-knit family in Shaker Heights, Ohio. She was a familiar face in the community, known for her warmth and friendly demeanor. Carol was the type of person who always took the time to talk with her neighbors and was quick to help out whenever she could. She stayed involved in the community, regularly volunteering at church functions and setting up neighborhood cookouts. Her warm and approachable personality made her a favorite among those who knew her. Carol resided in a cozy two-story house on a tree-lined street in Shaker Heights, a Cleveland suburb celebrated for its stunning architecture and close-knit community. Shaker Heights is often characterized by its bohemian charm, with a blend of historic and modern homes, local coffee shops, and a lively art scene, all underpinned by its progressive spirit. Inside Carol's home, the walls were adorned with family photos, the furniture invited relaxation, and the kitchen was always filled with the comforting scent of freshly baked cookies. Carol had a passion for cooking, and her chocolate chip cookies were legendary. She frequently brought them to work or shared them with her neighbors. Carol was married to Daniel McMillan, who was 16 years younger than her. Despite the age gap, Carol and Daniel seemed to be a very happy couple. Daniel worked for a health insurance company and often had a busy schedule, but the couple always made time for one another. They had been married for 5 years and lived with Carol's daughter from a previous marriage, 19-year-old Sarah Levinsky McMillan. Sarah was a bright and driven college student, studying pre-med with aspirations of becoming a doctor. Carol was incredibly proud of her daughter and supported her in every way possible. In the weeks before her passing, Carol was busy planning a family vacation to Orlando. She was thrilled about the trip and couldn't stop talking about it. She had recently bought a new suitcase and was eagerly packing it with summer clothes, sunscreen, and a fresh pair of sandals. Carol cherished the time she spent with her family and was eagerly looking forward to the getaway. However, her excitement was tragically cut short when, on the morning of April 17, 2019, Carol was found dead in her home. On the morning of April 17, 2019, Shaker Heights was slowly coming to life. The day was cool and overcast, a typical spring morning in Ohio. The neighborhood was calm, with only a few early risers out walking their dogs or picking up their morning coffee from Starbucks. Carol McMillan had always been an early riser, but something was amiss that day. Around 8:30 a.m., Sarah Levinsky McMillan, Carol's 19-year-old daughter, went downstairs to the kitchen and found her mother lying on the floor, unresponsive, with a can of Carol's favorite drink beside her. Diet Pepsi had spilled beside Carol, its sugary liquid slowly spreading into the grout between the tiles. In a panic, Sarah screamed and quickly dialed 911, her hands trembling. The dispatcher tried to soothe her, but Sarah was too overwhelmed to focus. Sarah, crying and pleading for help, was in a state of shock when the paramedics arrived minutes later. They found her pacing back and forth in the living room. The house was unsettlingly quiet, except for the faint echo of the 911 call coming from Sarah's phone on the kitchen counter. The paramedics hurried to Carol, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Sarah was left in shock, struggling to grasp the reality of what had just happened. Just the day before, Carol had been eagerly discussing their upcoming vacation, choosing outfits and making plans. Now she was gone, leaving Sarah feeling bewildered and adrift. While the paramedics worked, Sarah called her stepfather, Daniel McMillan, who was at work. His reaction was one of utter hysteria. He began wailing and almost screaming as Sarah cried on the phone. Daniel promised Sarah he would leave work immediately, but his voice was frantic with grief. The Shaker Heights Police Department responded quickly to the McMillan residence. Detective Laura Robacek, a seasoned investigator with over 15 years on the force, took charge of the case. Detective Robacek was known for her keen observations and methodical approach, with a track record of solving even the toughest cases. Upon arriving at the scene on the morning of April 17, 2019, she immediately sensed that something was amiss. The McMillan home was a typical, well-maintained suburban house with a neatly kept lawn and flower beds beginning to bloom with the arrival of spring. Inside, the house was clean and orderly, with the only indication of something amiss being the sight of Carol McMillan's lifeless body on the kitchen floor. Next to Carol was a spilled can of Diet Pepsi, its brown liquid pooling around her. Detective Robacek and her team began securing the crime scene, putting up yellow tape around the perimeter of the house and positioning officers at the entrance to keep onlookers and neighbors away. The investigators carefully examined the kitchen, finding no signs of forced entry and nothing appearing out of place. Carol's purse was on the counter, untouched, and the back door was locked from the inside. The team observed that the can of Diet Pepsi was still mostly full, with only a small amount spilled on the floor. This detail caught Robacek's attention. She directed the crime scene unit to collect the can and the remaining liquid as evidence. The team collected samples from the kitchen counter and floor to test for any unusual substances. They meticulously photographed the scene from all angles, documenting every detail. An autopsy was ordered to determine the precise cause of Carol's death. The paramedics on the scene had suspected a heart attack, but Robacek had her doubts. The position in which Carol was found, and the fact that she had been drinking her favorite soda, or pop, as it's called in the Midwest, moments before raised her suspicions. As the investigation progressed, the detectives thoroughly searched the house for additional clues. They examined Carol's personal belongings for any signs of foul play and took her phone as evidence, planning to review her recent calls and messages. Detective Robacek understood that this case would need a thorough and careful investigation. Carol McMillan's death appeared to be more complex than initially thought. As the investigation into her death unfolded, the police began focusing on those closest to her. Their first point of contact was her husband, Daniel McMillan. At 32, Daniel was significantly younger than Carol. He worked for a health insurance company in Cleveland and was known for being handsome, charming, and successful. With a stable job, a comfortable home, and a loving family, he seemed to have it all. As detectives delved deeper, they uncovered a different side of Daniel. He had met Carol 6 years earlier while working as a junior analyst at the insurance company. Carol, a widow at the time, had been captivated by his youthful energy and confidence. They married a year later, with Daniel becoming a stepfather to Carol's 13-year-old daughter, Sarah. Although their marriage appeared solid, friends observed that Daniel had grown more distant from Carol over the past year. He began working longer hours, frequently coming home late or claiming he had business trips. In his initial interview with the police, Daniel seemed calm and somewhat detached. Although he expressed shock over Carol's death, his emotions appeared subdued. He told Detective Laura Robacek that he had been at work when it happened and had hurried home as soon as Sarah called him. When questioned about his relationship with Carol, Daniel described their marriage as generally good but admitted they had drifted apart over time. He maintained that he had no involvement in her death and was puzzled as to why anyone would want to harm her. Despite his reassurances, Detective Robacek's suspicions began to intensify as the interview progressed. Daniel's demeanor was too composed and controlled. When questioned about Carol's plans, he was vague, claiming that he didn't keep track of his wife's daily activities because he considered himself a feminist. He also struggled to remember the last time they had a meaningful conversation or intimate moment as a couple. Robacek found it strange that Daniel, who claimed to love his wife, appeared so detached from her life. The detectives also noted inconsistencies in his statements. For example, although he said he was aware of Carol's favorite drink, Diet Pepsi, he couldn't account for why a half-empty can was found next to her body. Daniel claimed that Carol drank soda frequently but didn't seem to know much about her other habits or routines. As the police pressed him further, they began to explore his possible motives. Did Daniel want out of the marriage, or was there something more sinister at play? The investigation into his life uncovered that Daniel had been hiding secrets. One of the most shocking was his sexual obsession with his stepdaughter, Sarah. This revelation gave the police a new angle to pursue. If Daniel was in love with Sarah, it could explain why he might want Carol out of the way. Proving Daniel's involvement in Carol's death would require substantial evidence. Detective Robacek understood the need for a meticulous approach, carefully assembling the pieces of the emerging puzzle. The next focus of the investigation was Sarah Levinsky McMillan, Carol's 19-year-old daughter from a previous marriage. Sarah was a bright and ambitious young woman, on track to become a doctor. A pre-med student at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, she had earned a scholarship for her academic achievements. Known for her kindness and dedication, Sarah frequently volunteered at local hospitals and tutored underprivileged students in her spare time, a common pursuit in Shaker Heights. Sarah had always admired her mother, viewing Carol as a model of strength and compassion. They were incredibly close, often spending weekends shopping, watching movies, or simply talking about life while curled up together. Carol had been Sarah's biggest supporter, especially after the death of Sarah's biological father when she was a child. The loss had created an incredibly strong bond between mother and daughter, making Carol's sudden death even more devastating for Sarah. When the police first interviewed Sarah, she was visibly distraught. Her grief over losing her mother was intensified by the shock of discovering her body. Sarah explained to the detectives that she had been studying for a biology exam when she took a break to get a snack. Heading to the kitchen, she found her mother on the floor, unresponsive, with a can of Diet Pepsi nearby. In her panic, Sarah called 911, desperately hoping it wasn't too late. During the interview, Sarah was cooperative but deeply emotional. She described her mother as recently being happy and content, with no signs of stress or unhappiness. Sarah struggled to think of anyone who would want to harm Carol, portraying her mother as someone who was loved by everyone who knew her. The police questioned Sarah about her relationship with her stepfather, Daniel. She spoke highly of him, describing him as a haughty and a supportive father figure. Sarah was completely unaware of his secret sexual obsession with her, a revelation that heightened the police's concerns and suspicions. Despite their deep dive into Sarah's life, they found no evidence suggesting her involvement in her mother's death. Sarah's alibi was confirmed. She had been in her room studying at the time of the murder. Her social media activity was consistent with that of a typical college student, featuring posts about school, friends, liberal political causes, and upcoming exams. There were no indications of secret relationships or troubling behavior from Sarah. However, the police remained wary of the dynamics within the McMillan household. They questioned whether Sarah could have been an unwitting pawn in Daniel's scheme. If Daniel's obsession with Sarah was as intense as suspected, it raised concerns about Sarah's safety as well. With no evidence linking Sarah to the crime, detectives turned their attention to other leads. The third person they questioned was Jessica Miller, Carol's closest friend and confidant. At 45, Jessica was a real estate agent who had known Carol for over a decade. The two women had bonded over their shared experiences as working professionals in Shaker Heights, growing inseparable over the years. Jessica was frequently seen at Carol's home, helping with community events or sharing a glass of wine in the evenings. To those who knew them, their friendship appeared unbreakable, built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. The police soon uncovered a significant secret. Despite her apparent loyalty to Carol, Jessica had been having an affair with Daniel McMillan. This revelation shocked everyone familiar with the trio, particularly given Jessica's deep friendship with Carol. According to Jessica, the affair began about a year before Carol's death. She claimed it started innocently when Daniel attended one of her notorious hot tub parties. After a few flirtatious comments, their interaction quickly escalated into a full-blown sexual relationship. Jessica admitted to feeling a little bleeping guilty about betraying her friend, but said she couldn't resist Daniel's smoking hot bod during her police interview. She was nervous and defensive, aware that her affair with Daniel made her a suspect. Despite this, she insisted she had no involvement in Carol's death. Jessica said she was saddened by Carol's passing and had even thought about reducing her sexual encounters with Daniel out of guilt. She also revealed that Daniel had recently told her he was in love with someone else and wanted to end their relationship, which left her devastated. While Jessica didn't know the identity of the other woman, she suspected it might be someone younger, possibly Sarah. The detectives pressed Jessica for more details about her relationship with Daniel and her activities on the day of Carol's death. Jessica claimed she was at a real estate showing in Cleveland Heights and had clients who could verify her alibi. The police followed up on this and confirmed that Jessica was indeed with clients during the time of the murder. Despite her confirmed alibi, the detectives couldn't overlook the possibility that Jessica might have been involved, given her emotional turmoil and jealousy over Daniel's shifting affections. Her affair with Daniel and her close relationship with Carol made her a complex figure in the investigation, keeping her as a person of interest. The police had to consider whether Jessica's jealousy and heartbreak might have driven her to act impulsively. However, without concrete evidence linking her to the crime, Jessica remained in a difficult position, caught between her guilt over the affair and her grief over losing her friend. On April 27, 2019, just after 9:00 a.m., the weather in Shaker Heights was cool and overcast, typical for an Ohio spring. As investigators continued their search for clues, they received a significant break in the case. A toxicology report revealed that Carol McMillan's cause of death was cyanide poisoning. The lethal substance had been mixed into her can of Diet Pepsi, confirming that her death was a deliberate act of murder rather than a natural occurrence. The revelation that cyanide was used as the murder weapon shocked the investigation team. Cyanide is a rare and deadly poison, often linked to high-profile cases in espionage. The detectives realized they were dealing with a premeditated crime, indicating that someone had gone to great lengths to plan and execute Carol's murder. This new evidence shifted the focus of the investigation, providing a clearer direction. The detectives revisited the crime scene to search for any traces of the poison or clues about how it might have been introduced into Carol's drink. They carefully examined the Diet Pepsi can, the surrounding area in the kitchen, and any containers or objects that might have come into contact with the poison. Forensic experts were brought in to analyze everything from the remnants of the drink to the fingerprints on the can. Although no direct trace of cyanide was found in the kitchen itself, the team discovered traces of the poison on the rim of the can, confirming that it had been deliberately laced with the deadly substance. This discovery raised further questions about how the poison had been administered and who might have had the opportunity to carry out such a meticulous act. The police focused on uncovering who had access to cyanide and how it could have been introduced into Carol's drink without her noticing. They scrutinized the backgrounds of all the suspects for any knowledge of chemicals or access to dangerous substances. The detectives also investigated recent purchases and online searches that might indicate someone had been researching or acquiring cyanide. They were aware that cyanide was not easily obtainable and required careful tracking to pinpoint its source. The new evidence suggested significant planning behind the use of cyanide. This development put additional pressure on the suspects. The police re-interviewed them, concentrating on their knowledge of poisons and any suspicious behavior leading up to Carol's death. They sought to uncover any inconsistencies or clues that might reveal how the poison was obtained and administered. The detectives were resolute in their quest to identify who had the means and motive for such a calculated crime. With the case now firmly classified as murder, the investigation gained new urgency as they approached the truth. On April 20, 2019, just before noon, the police made a breakthrough that would bring them closer to the murderer. After carefully examining the evidence and re-interviewing the suspects, the detectives began to piece together a disturbing picture. All signs pointed to Daniel McMillan, Carol's husband, as the prime suspect in her death. Daniel, 32, was a charming and successful man who worked at a health insurance company. Outwardly, Daniel seemed to have it all: a stable job, a beautiful wife, and a seemingly perfect life in the progressive community of Shaker Heights. However, beneath this facade, he harbored dark and twisted desires. Daniel had developed an intense sexual obsession with Sarah Levinsky McMillan, Carol's daughter from a previous marriage. Daniel had secretly harbored sexual feelings for 19-year-old Sarah, who remained unaware of his intentions. As his obsession grew, Daniel became increasingly distant from Carol, viewing her as an obstacle to his disturbing fantasy of starting a new life with Sarah. Detectives uncovered key evidence linking Daniel to the crime, revealing his involvement in Carol's murder and his motive driven by his twisted desires. Daniel's internet search history revealed that he had been researching cyanide for several months before Carol's death. His searches included information on where to buy cyanide, how to use it, and its effects on the human body. This incriminating evidence suggested that Daniel had meticulously planned the murder, intending to use cyanide to eliminate Carol discreetly and without leaving a trace. On the day of the murder, Daniel exploited Carol's routine. Knowing she enjoyed a can of Diet Pepsi every day after work, he took advantage of this habit by spiking her can with cyanide. Daniel was aware that Carol would drink it as soon as she arrived home, making it the perfect opportunity to carry out his plan. The cyanide took effect swiftly, causing Carol to collapse and die within minutes. Daniel's plan was to stage it as a sudden heart attack, but the toxicology report exposed the truth. Confronted with the mounting evidence, Daniel was faced with the reality of his actions. Initially, Daniel tried to maintain his innocence. However, as the detectives presented the evidence, his internet searches, his obsession with Sarah, and the traces of cyanide on the can, his facade began to disintegrate. His arrest sent shockwaves through the Shaker Heights community. Carol's friends and neighbors were appalled to discover that the man they had once seen as a devoted husband had committed such a horrifying crime. Sarah's emotional turmoil was evident as she grappled with the betrayal and loss. The trial of Daniel McMillan, starting January 15, 2019, in Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court, captured widespread media attention. Local news outlets extensively covered the case, highlighting the shocking nature of the crime and the profound impact on the McMillan family. The trial would not only scrutinize Daniel's actions, but also address the emotional and psychological scars left behind by his betrayal. James Leakey meticulously laid out the evidence, including Daniel's internet searches for cyanide, the poison found in the diet Pepsi, and his motive rooted in his disturbing obsession with Sarah. The prosecution painted a clear picture of premeditated murder, aiming to secure a conviction that would reflect the gravity of Daniel's crime. Laura Phillips, a seasoned defense attorney, worked to discredit the prosecution's case. She argued that while Daniel had indeed searched for information about cyanide, there was no direct evidence proving he used it to poison Carol. Phillips suggested that the evidence was circumstantial and that Daniel's obsession with Sarah was not a motive strong enough to justify the murder. She emphasized Daniel's otherwise clean record and claimed that the intense grief and shock Daniel displayed after Carol's death should be taken into account. Phillips also tried to introduce reasonable doubt by questioning the accuracy of the forensic tests and the interpretation of Daniel's internet searches. Despite her efforts, the overwhelming evidence presented by Leakey made it difficult for the defense to shift the jury's perception. He claimed that Daniel had deliberately planned Carol's murder, citing the cyanide found in Carol's diet Pepsi and Daniel's numerous online searches about the poison. Leakey portrayed Daniel's actions as deliberate and methodical, stressing that his fixation on Sarah Levinsky McMillan motivated him to commit the crime. In contrast, Daniel's defense attorney, Laura Phillips, 38, offered an alternative view. Phillips contended that Daniel was overwhelmed by personal issues and stress, which could have impaired his judgment. She argued that his actions were not premeditated but a consequence of mental instability. Phillips also claimed that there wasn't enough direct evidence linking Daniel to the poisoning. Despite her arguments, the evidence against him was substantial. Throughout the trial, Carol's family, especially Sarah, were present each day, visibly distressed by the proceedings. Sarah, in particular, struggled as she faced the harsh reality of her stepfather's betrayal and her mother's death. The courtroom was filled with tearful testimonies from Carol's friends and colleagues, who spoke of her as a kind and loving person who would never have deserved such a tragic end. After days of testimony and evidence, the jury deliberated and delivered their verdict on January 22, 2019. Daniel McMillan was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence brought a blend of relief and sadness to Carol's family and friends. While they felt justice had been served, the grief of losing Carol and the betrayal by Daniel left deep scars. The verdict provided closure to the case, but the emotional impact on those affected was profound and enduring. Carol's friends and family faced the challenging task of moving forward, seeking to rebuild their lives while cherishing the warmth and kindness Carol had shared with them. The trial served as a sobering reminder of the hidden darkness that can exist behind outwardly perfect facades. As Shaker Heights began to return to its normal rhythm following Daniel McMillan's trial and sentencing, the emotional impact of the case remained deeply felt by those affected. The McMillan family was irrevocably altered by the events, and the community continued to deal with the repercussions of the crime. Daniel McMillan was moved to the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction to begin serving his life sentence. The high-profile nature of his trial made him a well-known figure within the prison system. His time in prison was a far cry from the comfortable life he once had. The media kept a close watch on his adjustment to incarceration and his interactions with fellow inmates. For Sarah Levinsky McMillan, Carol's daughter, the future was filled with challenges as she worked to rebuild her life and cope with the profound loss of her mother and the betrayal by her stepfather. As a pre-med student at the time of her mother's death, Sarah was deeply impacted by the murder. After the trial, she decided to take a break from her studies to focus on her mental health, and come to terms with the trauma she had endured. During this period, she leaned on the support of friends, family, and professional counselors to help her navigate through her grief and emotional recovery. Her community rallied around her, admiring her resilience and strength during this challenging period. Jessica Miller, Carol's former friend and Daniel's secret lover, also faced repercussions from the case. Although she was cleared of direct involvement in the murder, the affair and her connection to Daniel made her a controversial figure in the aftermath. Jessica's real estate business took a hit from the negative publicity surrounding the case. She chose to relocate to a different city to restart her life and career, aiming to distance herself from the past. Over time, Carol's friends and family focused on finding a new sense of normalcy and healing from the trauma they had endured. Carol's friends and family dedicated themselves to honoring her memory by continuing the community work she had been passionate about. They chose to remember her in positive ways, despite the trauma and betrayal of the case. The event served as a sobering reminder of how swiftly a life can be altered by violence and betrayal, leaving enduring scars on those left behind. A Truthsful Crime Case, interested in more real-life murder mysteries? Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Do you have any thoughts about this case, or have a case of your own you'd like us to investigate? Leave us a comment. Until then, stay safe.